I'm also in uncharted territory because I'm going to be quoting people, things that people said in 2020. And normally the people I quote are long dead, and this is being recorded, but hopefully it'll be okay. And apologies in advance to anyone who is quoted or anyone who's not quoted and thinks they should have been. But the Decade Centenaries brought a lot of positives, I think, and for historians like myself, there have been an awful lot. Being able to speak at events like this and many others. And I think Tanya will probably talk a little bit more about some of the positive aspects at a local level. To be a little bit contrarian, I'm going to talk about maybe the major controversy of the Decade of Centenaries. It's a controversy that I think demonstrates the power and the resonance of the history of the Irish Revolution to mobilise popular opinion, to stir emotions, generate debate. But it's also, I think, a controversy that highlights the limits of commemoration and the limits of something like the Decade of Centenaries, particularly where commemoration is deemed to be an act of reconciliation or of healing. And I suppose I want to talk or think a little bit about the limits of what we regularly heard described over the Decade of Centenaries as shared history or pluralist approaches to history. And I think this is one example where maybe that was not the case. The Easter Rising was quite deliberately the centrepiece of the decade in terms of scale and funding and lots of other things. And it got off to a very inauspicious start. There was a launch video that Dermot Ferreter described as ahistorical shit. So, you know, I think that generated a lot of concern about what was to follow. But widely, and I don't know if everyone in the room agrees with this, but widely speaking, the centenary of 1916 has been considered a success. Most of the commentary you'll find will say that it was balanced, inclusive, highlighted previously neglected stories, maybe not all previously neglected stories or all of the ones we would like, but certainly many of them. And this carried on for a number of years after 1916 or 2016 until 2020 when, as Fergal McGarry described it, the wheels abruptly came off the commemorative bandwagon with a proposal in early 2020 to commemorate the role of the Royal Irish Constabulary and the Dublin Metropolitan Police in Irish history. And it's telling of the legacy of the RIC and Dublin Metropolitan Police, but particularly the legacy of the RIC in Ireland, that it was this proposal and not, for example, questions about the mandate for violence in 1916, a war of independence ambush, or even a civil war atrocity that brought the most contentious moment of the Decade of Centenaries. And indeed, there were people in early 2020 who said this is a warning for the rest of the decade in terms of what could happen. Really, nothing like the 2020 controversy was repeated. The Civil War passed off relatively quietly in comparison. So I think that says something about the RIC and how the RIC has been remembered. The RIC, which was the police force for the island of Ireland outside of the Dublin metropolitan area, and which was at the front line of British efforts to suppress insurgency in Ireland between 1919 and 1921. I have some pictures here. By 1922, when the force was disbanded, it was a mix of so-called old RIC, those who were later labelled old RIC, Irishmen, mostly Catholics and often farmers' sons, who joined before 1919 or even before 1920, and the so-called black and tans, who were mostly but not exclusively British recruits who began to fill gaps in the force from 1920. Now, the black and tans were hired on the same terms as ordinary members of the RIC, but an auxiliary division was also created, which was a deliberate counterinsurgency force made up of former British officers. So many of the black and tans had been ex-servicemen. To join the auxiliary division, you had to have held a commission in the British Armed Forces. And at the start of 2020, it was announced that the government would hold an event to commemorate the men who had served in the RIC and DMP. And sort of what they were trying to commemorate varied a little bit, but ostensibly it was about men who'd served in those forces between 1836 and 1922, particular focus on those who were killed between 1919 and 22, and others earlier who'd been killed while members of the force. Scheduled for Dublin Castle on the 17th of January, less than 3 weeks after the announcement was made, and it would be addressed by the Minister for Justice and the Garda Commissioner. Now, in their guidance for the second phase of the Decade of Centenaries, the government's expert advisory group on commemorations had recommended specific initiatives to commemorate the RIC. The event that was announced appears to have been a solo run by then Minister for Justice Charlie Flanagan of Fine Gael, who doesn't seem to have secured approval for this from the Cabinet or from the all-party consultation group on commemorations. And some members of the expert advisory group publicly criticised the proposal and the manner of the announcement, presumably because it wasn't what they had in mind. But others also remained silent on the matter as well. It was, though, initially publicly supported by Fine Gael Taoiseach Leo Varadkar. Now, later clarification claimed that this was an event to commemorate Irish-born old RIC men who had joined the force before the War of Independence. And there was an effort to separate the commemoration, separate the old RIC from those later recruits, the Black and Tans. And supporters of the commemoration similarly sought to frame it as a commemoration of Irish and not British members, and as an opportunity for reconciliation or an acknowledgement of shared and complicated histories on the island. But ultimately the proposal proved inseparable from the popular memory of Black and Tans and auxiliaries. Earlier in 2019, Flanagan had attended a by then annual service organised by the Historical and Reconciliation Police, or the HARP Society, and he was the first government minister to do so. And at that service, the names of RIC and DMP men killed in 1919 were read out. And afterwards, Flanagan publicly stated that these were men who were killed doing their job. As he put it, they were murdered in the line of duty. They were doing what police officers do. As they saw it, they were protecting communities from harm. They were maintaining the rule of law. These are fundamental to police services everywhere. And this is presumably behind Flanagan's rationale for organising or announcing the 2020 event. But this proposal was very widely and quite robustly criticised, and the January 2020 announcement provoked over a week of sometimes quite intense debate that got coverage across both the local and the national media across the island, and indeed further afield as well. Now, HARP Society founder Jim Hurley declared himself shocked at this response, the response that the proposal generated. But it did become quickly very clear that those who supported Flanagan's plan were in a minority. And some critics went as far as making comparisons with the notion of commemorating Oliver Cromwell in such places for enlightened debate as social media, but also in one case in a letter to the Taoiseach. The first public representative, or certainly one of the first public representatives to publicly criticise the prospective event was the Mayor of Clare, Fianna Fáil's Cathal Crowe, who's a UL history graduate, as it happens. And Crowe argued that in the main, I think all of the government state commemorations have been apt and tasteful, but I see the commemoration of the RIC as a step too far. He also suggested that it was, as he put it, wrong to celebrate and eulogise. I consider commemorate to be a verb with positive connotations, an organisation that was the strong arm of the British state in Ireland. And I think it may be a question for later is, what is commemoration supposed to be? Is it a celebration? Are those two things one and the same? The proposed commemoration was also widely criticised by public representatives in Limerick, and this was largely representative of sort of broader discourse. On the 7th of January 2020, then Mayor of Limerick City and County Council Michael Sheehan, a Fine Gael colleague of Charlie Flanagan, announced that he would not attend the event on behalf of the council. And it was later clarified that his deputy wouldn't attend either. He later noted that the curfew murders of two of his predecessors in 1921 and the role of the RIC in raids on their homes. And as it happened, Sheehan's political opponent, Sinn Féin TD Maurice Quinlivan, similarly asked the Limerick leader to remember that it was the RIC who murdered the two mayors of Limerick, George Clancy and Michael O'Callaghan, in 1921. The curfew murders and the killings of Clancy and O'Callaghan obviously very much part of the commemorative landscape in Limerick in 2021. But for Quinlivan, there was, as he described it, certainly no public demand for this commemoration of the RIC and the Black and Tans, as most Irish people recognised that they were brutal enforcers of British rule in Ireland. I have no problem whatsoever with people remembering their family members who served in the RIC or other colonialist militias. Everyone, of course, has the right to mourn and remember their dead. However, I find it highly inappropriate that as a state which has still not been reunified, we would commemorate a police force who brutally imposed the occupation of our nation by a foreign colonial regime. The role of the RIC and the DMP were not merely to act as a police force, but they had a specific role to instill terror in the populace in an attempt to break the domestic will of the Irish people for independence. And as was reported in the Limerick Leader, on Facebook, independent councillor Frankie Daly declared that under no circumstances will I turn my back on brave Irish people who gave and lost their lives for Irish freedom. I will not be attending this sickening commemoration, and this event must be boycotted by the Government of Ireland. And there's all sorts of variations of this sort of rhetoric. Dublin City Council actually said something quite similar as well, in announcing that they wouldn't be represented. And while Quinlivan and others were keen to paint this as a Fine Gael event, or as Fine Gael revisionism, Fine Gael revisionism gone mad perhaps, Fine Gael TD for Limerick County Tom Neville stated his belief that the planned event was divisive, and these type of events are meant to be inclusive and to take place in an atmosphere of inclusivity. Fianna Fáil TD Niall Collins, again part of the government, suggested that the event had been bungled completely in the way that it was announced. And again, lots of criticism of how the government handled the proposal, the announcement, what they proposed as well. And around the same time as these comments, a statement was issued by Flanagan announcing that, given the disappointing response of some to the planned event on 17th of January, I do not believe that the event as planned can now take place in an atmosphere that meets the goals and guiding principles of the overall commemorative programme, whatever they might have been. Therefore, I am announcing its deferral, and this was pending further consultation with the expert advisory group. Now, he also made a point of mentioning that in organising the event or announcing the event, he was following their guidance, which was to have initiatives about the RIC and DNP. Leo Varadkar supported the deferral, but I think less credibly suggested that the controversy had been a setback for conciliation and unity, perhaps giving the idea of supposedly mature or pluralist commemoration much more power than it actually holds. I think the idea that a commemorative event would advance or scupper Irish unity is maybe taken just a little bit too far in the grand scheme of things. But the calls were for this event to be cancelled rather than postponed or deferred. And Flanagan initially insisted that it was only being postponed, but it was inevitably cancelled soon after. And then in January 2021, following a parliamentary question from Cathal Crowe, who was Flanagan's successor, or to Flanagan's successor as Minister for Justice, Helen McEntee, she announced in the Dáil that the RIC and DNP commemoration would not be revived. In the interim, a general election had taken place, and Crowe was among the first-time TDs elected to the Dáil in 2020. And it's impossible, I think, to declare confidently about the influence that the commemoration controversy had on voting patterns and on end results. But it was clearly associated with Fine Gael in the public mind, and does appear to have done some damage to the party in that election, and provided a fillip to some of its more vocal opponents. Fine Gael's Tom Neville was among those to lose his seat, although again people from the constituency will have better ideas about why that might have been the case. And his own reservations about the RIC commemoration seemingly did nothing to save his seat if the commemoration controversy had done anything to put it at risk. And just on a kind of global scale, this is a poster vandalised, one of Charlie Flanagan's election posters vandalised with RIC. Johnny Girk, a Sinn Féin councillor in 2020, produced this poster making reference, I guess in the same way in Limerick people referred to the curfew murders. Here we have a reference to the burning of Trim by Black and Tans, and I think auxiliaries as well. And Girk was also elected for Sinn Féin in 2020. So it had some influence. The extent of its influence, again, we can discuss and debate, and we'll probably never know. Now, the minority of supporters of the RIC commemoration could be as guilty as its opponents in terms of cherry picking or oversimplifying. The misuse of the term special reserve is maybe the most obvious example of this. The Black and Tans were permanent full-time recruits to the Royal Irish Constabulary. The shortage of uniforms that prompted the nickname, which was a reference to a pack of hounds from the Limerick Hunt, was soon resolved. And over time, eventually, they wore the same uniform. In theory, they did the same job, although accents and background and training would have been different. The separate auxiliary division was nominally linked to the RIC, but essentially operated autonomously. And Black and Tans and auxiliaries were routinely mixed up and conflated at the time, and have been ever since. So there wouldn't have been any Black and Tans, for example, stationed in Dublin City. It was a DMP area, and it was primarily the auxiliaries. But people at the time in Dublin referred to Tans and Auxies and sort of used both of those terms interchangeably. So any confusion is perhaps understandable in that regard. And pointing out kind of minor historical inaccuracies might be dismissed as unnecessary pedantry, not least given the well-documented role of the Crown Forces in the Irish War of Independence and what was an often well-deserved reputation for brutality. But I think interrogating the proposed commemoration and its fallout doesn't have to be an exercise in explaining or whitewashing the brutality of Crown Force reprisals in Ireland, which again some people accused those who supported of doing. But it is a reminder of the powerful legacy of the Black and Tans, and that term Black and Tans, which immediately brings about certain imagery and ideas in people's minds, and the ways in which it can still be mobilised. It's also a reminder of the often uneasy relationship between history and commemoration, and the ways in which commemoration often prefers the easily digestible, recognisable narratives over the complicated and messy realities. So there is, for example, no evidence, certainly that I'm aware of, that the Black and Tans were a special reserve. And that term is never really officially used as far as I've ever seen. And I'm not sure where it appeared from or how it came about. But the term does appear to have been used, in certain contexts at least, to separate the Black and Tans from the old RIC, to draw a clear line of distinction between these two groups, to separate the British-born recruits sent to brutally suppress a campaign for national liberation from Irish-born men who joined an ordinary civil police force. And whereas Flanagan would have described it doing their duty. And I think, again, all sorts of, the Black and Tans are described in all sorts of odd and inaccurate ways, particularly after Joe Biden made his kind of gaffe on his visit, where he referred to smashing the Black and Tans instead of the All Blacks. And the news coverage of that in Ireland, funny enough, it generally wasn't deemed necessary to explain what the term Black and Tans meant, but where people tried to explain it, there were all sorts of odd formulations for Black and Tans. They were an army sent by Churchill, they were a part-time force, a military force, a special force, and none of that really adds up. But again, what it shows is just how the kind of mythology, I guess, to touch on something we've heard already today, can take over. And one of the most significant proponents of the Special Reserve label has been Jim Herlihy, who was one of the leading public figures, I guess, in support of the commemoration, but also an historian who's done a huge service to people interested in the RIC or those with RIC relatives. But in his book, recent genealogical guide, The Black and Tans, he seems to make this kind of distinction between the old RIC and the Black and Tans. And it is clear that there was no desire anywhere to commemorate Black and Tans or auxiliaries. That's one thing that most people had in common. That was a line that nobody necessarily said they wanted to cross. Michael Quinlivan suggested that in no other state that has emerged from anti-colonial struggle would they celebrate the deeds of the oppressors. And I'm not really aware of any other comparable examples where a state would commemorate a force which had the role that the RIC had in suppressing the movement for independence. And that was ultimately the role of the RIC. It doesn't tell the full story of the RIC and the history of the RIC, but that was, as far as the British government were concerned, that was part of their job from 1919 to 21. Now, maybe Ireland missed an opportunity to be a standard bearer for mature, considered and pluralistic commemoration by not holding this event and showing itself to be a state confident enough in its own origin story to be able to acknowledge its enemies. But I wonder if that's the sort of thing that commemoration is about or has ever been about. Does anyone commemorate in that sort of way? And again, I just don't know. I'm not aware. I'd love to hear where there's some example of a state doing something like what Flanagan had proposed. And that's not to say whether that makes it a good idea or a bad idea, but certainly Ireland wouldn't be unique in something like this causing trouble, I would suggest. And ultimately, we can't ignore the Black and Tans and auxiliaries when we think about the RIC and its role in Irish history, but we also can't ignore the complexities of that history as well. So you can't ignore Irishmen who resigned from the force, Irishmen who took part in reprisals, as some of them did, Irishmen who became Black and Tans. Some of the so-called Black and Tans were born in Ireland, and indeed some auxiliaries were born in Ireland. And I suppose one thing that the commemoration controversy has confirmed is the extent to which specific ideas about Black and Tans are ingrained in the Irish psyche, and they're ideas that hold some truth but also oversimplify in other ways. And that emotional power that the term holds, I think, is significant in its own way, and maybe in ways people didn't realise in 2012 or 2016. I think at that stage nobody really knew where the line was in terms of this idea of shared history. And it turns out that the line was with commemorating the RIC and indeed the DMP. And I guess also with the necrology wall at Glasnevin, which generated controversy in its own right and was damaged and now has been taken out of commission. This is clearly where the lines were drawn. I don't know if anyone realised where the lines would be in 2012. There were some who believed that there should have been some commemoration or some acknowledgement of the RIC, just not the one that was proposed. Councillor Emmett O'Brien, whose grandfather had resigned from the RIC, as he put it, before the Black and Tans, in a contribution on Live 95 FM, he argued that there was a role somewhere for the brave men of the RIC who resigned from the RIC to honour the Republic and to honour the people of Ireland who voted in 1918, but that the government's efforts were ham-fisted. He also referred to the Black and Tans, meanwhile, as psychopaths, and that's the phrase that he used. But even recognising that there were what were later described as resigned or dismissed RIC, and sort of acknowledging those men, specifically the men who resigned or were dismissed for nationalist sympathies, would fail to acknowledge the experiences of men who didn't resign, who kept their heads down, who stayed in till the end, and who are still considered within their families to have been decent men, and often decent men doing their job as policemen. And it's something that Sean Gannon I've come across in interviews we've been doing with RIC relatives. And the sample of RIC relatives we're interviewing is from a very specific cohort largely, but that is certainly part of the story. Now those with relatives in the IRA or coming on could feel they could openly talk about their family past and their family history if they wanted to, and they could do it quite triumphantly, I think, as well. Descendants of the RIC and DMP will have found opportunities to publicly remember their own family histories much more limited. And I suppose, like Sharon, I don't have any relatives who are in any of these organisations at all. But we shouldn't underestimate the desire to do so, to tell family stories, to talk about family stories. And the desire to feel proud of whatever lives grandfathers or great-grandfathers may have lived, and whatever little they might be said to have accomplished, even if they ultimately fell on the wrong side of history. Now, Tony Connolly's documentary, which was produced on RT recently, might be a sign that that's changing a little bit, that documentary was broadcast and I don't think caused any great backlash. The fact that it didn't cause a backlash might be down to the fact that the programme essentially followed a life story and didn't really make any effort to explain or justify the existence of the RIC or its actions. And the RIC was not a monolith. It was very many things to many people, including the over 80,000 members who served in the force over its history. And we can describe the RIC as a colonial force acting on behalf of the British government. We can also describe it as an ordinary civil police force made up of Irishmen doing their duty, and that's how some people would have seen it at the time, and some people have seen it since. The point being that there's not necessarily one accepted narrative, or there wasn't over the course of the history of the RIC, even if that all changed quite drastically by 1919. So maybe before we get to anything else, perhaps the first step is to get a better understanding of the complexities of the history of something like the RIC or the DMP. And it seems to me that the decade of Centenaries largely failed in that regard. I think it was largely impervious to decades of academic research. But it's also important to remember that commemoration has always been much more about the present than it is about the past, and we shouldn't expect any different. Thanks very much.